Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin. Today's November 5th. I do have my I voted sticker on, but joining me in my virtual studio is Dr. Vanessa Hills. Vanessa, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I don't have a voted sticker. I early voted in my state, I promise.
Perfect. So, Vanessa is someone that I met at the Midwest Academy of Management conference, I think 2 weekends ago. And we sat down, we were talking, and Vanessa is someone who has a lot of interests that align with mine. She's someone who's interested in leadership. She's someone who is a consultant. She's someone who has done a lot of exciting things. So I wanted to bring her on. I wanted to talk about all the cool things she's interested in, everything that she is doing. So Vanessa, could you give a little bit of background about who you are and what you're doing?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brendan. So first of all, I very recently defended my dissertation. So I've got my PhD in organizational change leadership from Western Michigan University. And I'm currently a senior consultant with the Landers Consulting Group, but I also have my own, small consulting firm here in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So that's my primary occupation now, but I'm just off the heels of academia.
Wonderful. So something that we were talking about at Midwest, we were talking about the work we were doing, but when we were talking off camera, Vanessa gave me a couple ideas that we could talk about in this conversation. But something that she highlighted and that we talked a little bit about was something called participatory change. Do you want to dig into that? Tell us what that is, how you're doing it in your consulting work, and why it's so important for managers to focus on.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, participatory change is a mouthful. It's hard to pronounce. I struggle all the time. But it is basically when lots of people get to participate in the change within an organization. So it goes by a lot of different names. You might have heard things like, I think, dialogic change, emergent change, democratic change, all kind of fall within the same umbrella. But it's basically having lots of perspectives in the entire change process. So from planning to implementation to evaluation, instead of just having a couple of people at the top kind of telling you what the change is and planning it from there, lots of people are involved in it. So participatory change is good for a lot of reasons, but the biggest one is really that it works more often than planned change. So you've probably heard these numbers. I feel like they're floating around a lot in our field, but something between 50 to 75% of planned organizational changes fail, which is kind of staggering because that's what organizations do. We're always changing, and it's a lot of wasted time and resources and stuff when it fails. So this participatory change, where lots of people are involved, has a much higher success rate. Also does great things like increase employee retention and creativity and innovation. So there's a lot of pros to it. And I wish we could just end here and be like, yep, so that's great and everyone should do that and we can go home. But there obviously are, a lot of challenges as well with implementing something like that.
And before we go into those, all the facets of participatory change, I think it'd be good to talk about why organizations need to change. Obviously, I think people are aware that technology changes, demographic changes, that exist in the environment. Obviously, the biggest one right now is artificial intelligence. How are organizations going to do that? But why do organizations need to change, and why kind of do organizations need to do this continuous incremental change? Because I think everyone's aware that people need to change and keep up with the times. But what is organizational change? And before we dive into a method that you really like, can you talk a little bit about organizational change and development?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, organizational change is really any kind of transformation happening within the organization. And some of them are really big, like, new AI technologies being used in ways that have never been used before in organizations, or really big stuff like, beginning of 2020, all of a sudden everyone's working remotely from home. So a lot of shifts there, but they can also be really small changes like process changes and, introducing new roles, which changes the structure, the hierarchy, the culture of an organization. But if you don't do that, you're just stagnating, right? It's kind of a necessity. We hear about stories, I think companies like that come to mind, Blockbuster and, Kodak Film and things like that. If you don't change, if you don't consistently look for new ways to improve, and stay ahead of the curve, it's kind of a failure for organizations. It's likely not going to end well. So change has to happen, but unfortunately, it is a lot of hard work. It's messy and it fails a lot.
And what drew you to participatory change? Because I think there's a lot of ways that change can occur, and you've talked about how everyone can be involved, and you've talked about some of the benefits. But why are you specifically drawn to it, and what are some things that you've found in your research and in your consulting work?
I think one of the things that really drew me to it was when I was actually, working in organizations, I was seeing what I think a lot of people say is participatory change and sounds really good. And I think a lot of leaders know how to talk about change being something that involves a lot of people. And then sometimes in the day to day, living through of those changes and enacting the processes, you're like, well, that's not actually what was said. I thought we got to, have more of a say, or I thought when we had that town hall and I spoke up and I did all those qualitative survey responses, I thought that meant that we might go in that direction. And obviously, no one person gets to decide how to do change necessarily in that format, but it's not always something that really does involve everybody, even when we say it is. So I was really interested just in that phenomenon, like as it existed that I observed in organizations. Um, and then I was really there's two scholars that write a lot about dialogic OD, and I love their stuff. So that's Bush and Marshak are two great scholars, still doing great work today. Um, and they really talk about the benefits of these types of change efforts. So that's seeing it and then reading about it, and I was like, okay, this is an
Mhm.
area that I really want to work in.
So, organizational development, organizational change as it occurs right now, people are talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. Is that what I'm
Yeah,
hearing?
absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
and what's an example of that? They promise some new process. They promise some new, they're going to give raises. They're going to do X, Y, and Z, and it just doesn't happen. Or is it something along the lines of they've kind of already made up their mind, and when they give out surveys, it's kind of to fish for the data they want to support the changes that they already are going to be making?
Yeah, it's the second example you gave, I think, is something that happens a lot. Both sort of in research interviews, hearing executives say things along those lines, but also just in personal life and among my friends and peers talking about how the change process works in their organizations. It's often a lot of, talking about how we want your opinion, we're going to hold a town hall, we're going to hear some thoughts. But then if people show up to the town hall to lead that and they already have their mind made up, people can tell, people can sense that maybe they're not actually getting involved in the process. And I think that can be almost sometimes worse than if you weren't involved at all and no one said you were involved. If it's just like, well, I'm just following orders, that's,
Hmm.
part of my job. But when you're asked to weigh in and asked to contribute and think critically, and then no one's listening to it, that's really hard. That's a tough spot for an employee.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the right term, but it's leading them on and saying, "Hey, we're going to promise you
Yeah.
this. We're leading you on, and we're not going to deliver." So that brings up an interesting issue because I could see participatory change being a lot easier in smaller firms, let's say 25, 50 employees, where the CEO, the executive team knows everyone. But when you get to organizations with thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, global multinational corporations, how do organizations actually do this? What's been your experience, and how do we do this? Because I think everyone wants an organization where everyone has a voice, everyone has an input. I think that makes sense. Obviously, the CEO, the C-suite team, they're going to have to be the ones who ultimately make the decisions. But I think there are people on the front lines, there are middle level managers who can give good insights. But how do we actually do this? Because I think on paper, I think what we're talking about sounds good, but how do we actually implement this?
$1 million question. It's a great question, and I think that you're absolutely spot on about the size of the organization playing a big role. So if you can all fit into one room, it's going to be a lot easier to get everyone's opinion at the same time, right? That's just an obvious kind of physical factor. But I still think that even when organizations are really big, there are ways you can get everybody to weigh in, not in the same room at the same time, unless you're renting out like a football stadium or something. But we can ask people who will be touched by the change process. So if we're changing something, in a manufacturing facility, how do the people in the manufacturing facility feel about the problem? How do the people who are actually going to be interacting with that process, what are their thoughts? They might have opinions and insight that you don't have if you're working in corporate, and just saying, I think this policy makes sense. So maybe in that instance, you don't need to get feedback from everyone in the entire organization, but you could talk to people who are going to be impacted by the change. And sometimes that means a representative sample. You know, you can't talk to
Mhm.
everybody, but definitely getting diverse perspectives, not just the C suite, not just, managers and marketing, but really hearing from people at different levels throughout the organization, I think is really important.
And I think that's hard to actually be able to listen to people, to a wide range of people. Do managers not implement this change? Is it a conscious decision? Is it an unconscious bias that people have? How come people who try to do this? Because I'm sure it's not necessary. I'm sure some executives come to the table and say, "Hey, I want this to be a decision that the organization makes as a whole." Because I'm sure people would like that. Again, we've talked about how I think it's good if people in organizations make change. So if some executives come to the table and want to involve people in this change process, why doesn't it actually go to the end? How come it doesn't actually get completed? Is it a conscious bias? Is it some kind of unconscious bias or something else?
It's really a combination of all the above, but I want to focus on, I definitely agree with you. I don't think that leaders are going, haha, we're going to tell them one thing, and then while they're looking the other way, we're really going to implement our original
Mhm.
plan. I think maybe that happens, but I think, leaders are in the same boat as the rest of us. They're trying to do their jobs to the best of their abilities, right? So it's a combination of conscious and unconscious factors. So from the conscious side, sometimes people really do believe that, this kind of stakeholder led change, this democratic change is the best thing for the organization. But they're also feeling pressure from the board of directors, or they're like, that sounds great, but people are stretched thin enough as it is. We can't get them away from their work. Or it's expensive. It takes a lot of time. We've got deadlines. We need to make a change right now. We can't afford to, have a group discussion about it. So there are a lot of valid conscious reasons that, leaders might be torn about it. But on that unconscious level, there's a ton of unconscious processes that are happening for individual leaders that are stopping them from giving up control. Because really that's what participatory change is to a leader, is you don't get to control the process anymore. So even people who aren't controlling, still you have control over it. That's kind of what, being a
Mhm.
leader is to some extent, right? And so if you're giving power to everybody else, that's scary. I mean, it's scary for me. There are a lot of things that I'm like, I've done this before. I think I know what I'm doing. And I don't know that I would let 50 people vote on the right thing to do if I'm pretty confident I know the right course of action. So, yeah, unconsciously, there can be a lot of, cognitive biases, like seeing patterns maybe where they don't exist because you're sort of anticipating the pattern, or a bias in your own experience, thinking that's stronger than something else. Um, and then part of my dissertation research, I was really interviewing executives using kind of psychodynamic methods. So I am not a clinically trained psychoanalyst, so that's why I say psychodynamic, because it's not used to treat mental health illness or anything. It's just to observe and to gain knowledge. But I was asking people um, how they would describe themselves as leaders, how they would describe their role in the change process. And then I also asked them, and then tell me really specifically the details of the change you led. And what I got a lot of the time was people saying, absolutely yes to participatory change. It's so important. I value relationships. I want people to be heard. And I believe that was all genuine, right? This is what people want and think. But then when they describe the change, it's a lot of, I know they need to feel heard. So I had them come in. Didn't impact us at all. But I think they felt better having had the chance to speak. Or, my team of three talked about it, and then we sold everyone on the idea, and they really felt like it was their idea. And to me, that's not really participatory change, although maybe it's possible that everyone's happy with the arrangement.
Mhm.
But it's really, there's people aren't always aware of whether or not they're actually being democratic and participatory when they're leading change.
So I have two thoughts from that. First one, if we look at just a very simple change model, like Lewin's change model, um, what is it? Refreeze, change, freeze. I think that's what it is, if I remember. Um, and I feel like for people to buy into the need for change or the actual change, if they can be a participant in that, obviously they're going to have accept the change more if they're actually involved. If you just get orders from the top, your marching orders, that's going to be a lot harder to follow than maybe you're someone who's actively involved with the change. But something else that I thought of as you were talking, when you're talking about this unconscious bias, you talked about how maybe it's a financial decision, maybe it's a productivity decision why you can't make changes. And it can be maybe some principal agent issue where if someone towards the lower end of the organization says, hey, I need this resource, or maybe I need some more time off, or maybe we need to change this policy, maybe they have some type of incentive structure that wants them to make some change, but for the organization as a whole it won't make as much sense. So I could see there being kind of a misalignment between what's best for the organization and what's best for the employee themselves, because in a perfect world you're going to have incentive structures that align with organizational goals, but in
Mhm.
reality, does that make sense for a lower level employee to be incentivized and paid the same way that a CEO is someone who's looking at a longer term? So I think that's going to introduce issues as well, because we go back to our initial statement, change needs to happen, but where does that come from? So I think that introduces just another layer of complexity of this whole issue.
Absolutely. I think complexity is a good word because I think it's important to have the conversations, but I think anyone who tells you I figured it out is got to
Mm-hmm.
be wary of that person.
Mm-hmm.
um, for the first point that you brought up, I heard actually it's from a consultant named Bennett Bratt. He said this and I loved it. It was like asking people if you ever take your car through the car wash or vacuum it or get it detailed, and most people who have cars are like, oh yeah, sometimes I do that. And then he asked, how many of you do that for your rental cars? And I'm like, well, no, I'm not going to, vacuum my rental car unless there's some huge reason I need to. That seems like an odd thing. It's because when we own things, we care for them better. We're more invested in what happens. And so I think that for participatory change, if people can feel like they were part of the process, they're way more invested in what happens and in the results of that process. But to your second point, yeah, I mean, there are people at all levels of the organization who have different amounts of information, different incentive structures. So I don't think we need to get consensus on everything, especially in huge organizations, but making sure that there's a platform for people to give their insight, their feedback, and also that there is some kind of mechanism in place to absorb that, whether it's listened to or not, but to truly, be giving it attention and processing that information.
So we've been talking about organizational change, organizational development from kind of a macro level. Do you have any specific examples you want to share with us, that of change that you've led, or case studies, or things in the news that you've read that are a little bit more specific that could give us better examples of what we're dealing with?
Sure. Well, I can tell you a story from a place that I worked many years ago where I was helping to organize a town hall, and we had a consultant come in who was, great at her job and was leading this town hall, and it was all about how to kind of think about the organization, some strategic planning moving forward. There were people from various levels who were there, different job descriptions. On paper, everything was great, except the CEO decided he really needed to be there. And that changed the dynamic. And he piped up a few times about, well, actually, in this industry, this is the. And so you could just feel in the room people were shutting down. And instead of giving their honest feedback about, future changes and what the company could be, people were either being quiet or they were just kind of repeating what they thought higher ups would want to hear. And so I think there's a real danger in that because then the CEO and others think we did it. We let everyone have their voice. We listened, and it turns out they want the same things as we want. So perfect. That's great. But the actual employees who are in the room are feeling frustrated because they don't actually feel like their voices were heard. And for many of them, they might have thought this 90 minutes would have been better spent just getting my job done because it really didn't make a difference anyway. So I think that's what I want to avoid in organizations is either just administer the change and acknowledge it's a top down change and that has to happen sometimes, or be genuine about these, collaborative efforts that are taking place.
Well, you introduced something really interesting because if someone's in the room with you, you're not going to talk bad about them, even if there's something bad to be talked about. Especially if there's a dynamic where they're in a position of power, you're not going to talk bad about the CEO if you're trying to climb the ladder. So, this has probably been done, but if organizational change needs to occur, maybe you need to remove them entirely. Where, you have an impartial third party like a consultant, like Dr. Hills here, who comes in and says, "Hey, these are the recommendations from the employees. This is what they want," and present it not necessarily as us versus them, because you're not going to talk bad about your CEO when they're sitting right there. You're going to want to say things that kind of are going to help you because you have these two. And that's assuming that the change that you want to happen is going against what they want or going against kind of the status quo. But that introduces another layer of complexity. I
Yes.
keep repeating that phrase, but that's just something that came up when you're talking about that.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm the same way. I don't necessarily want to say a bunch of negative things about the place I work in front of my boss, right? I don't think many people are excited about that. So yeah, you have to create places where it's safe to do that, whether that's truly anonymous, whether that's town halls or, big, large gatherings where if executives are in the room, they're quiet or they're trained to say like, thanks for your feedback and not fight back and not push back, not punish people for what they're saying. And then I'm not an expert in this, but it seems like there really does have to be a level of psychological safety in place too for people to even feel comfortable saying anything critical because, if you're worried about losing your job, you're not going to speak up about anything, right? And for good reason.
And that's exactly what came up in my mind is when I think of change, I think of it on a more macro level, the organization as a whole. But this happens between individuals, this happens on teams. And as an organizational behavior researcher, I focus on individuals and teams. And psychological safety is one of the big things that I'm interested in because you can't have honest conversations unless you feel safe to disagree. Because what happens if everyone's trying to please everyone else? That's when you get groupthink. That's when people ideas get stagnant. That's when change actually doesn't occur, when people are just trying to keep the consensus.
Hmm. And something that I have seen done is if you have a big town hall and there's enough people that you can do this, or somebody on the inside, have a plant who's going to go first and say something critical, who has the
Mhm.
social capital to know that it's okay, to actually be the first one, and then especially if execs are in the room and they're anticipating this, they can be prepared to respond like, "Thanks so much. That's really good insight." And it really kind of role models what other people can say safely in the space, which, I wouldn't have thought of it if someone hadn't told me, but I think that can be a good way to get the ball rolling with not just positive comment after positive comment, over and over
Mhm.
again.
Well, I think that would be a great way to break the ice. You have someone, "Hey, I think our overtime policies are absolutely awful. We need to change this," and that's going to help everyone because when we talk about organizational culture, we have things that are visible. We have slogans, we have statements. Maybe someone sends out a memo with change for a town hall. But until someone actually does the thing, it doesn't truly actually exist. So, if you see someone making that first step and that kind of acceptance of that participatory change, then I think you're going to see that. So I think that'd be a great way to do that. So one thing um, I, I can't talk. One thing that I have a question on now is if you had to give a manager kind of a couple simple steps if they wanted to be better implementing organizational change, what advice do you have for them?
That's a good question. I think one of the first things would be if you're not thinking about participatory change or any kind of democratic approaches to change, start thinking about them first of all. If that's not even on your radar, it should be on your radar. And then second, I think a lot of it is internal and self-awareness. What are you saying and are your actions really lining up with that? Because again, a lot of the people I speak to, it's not conscious. They're not really, leading people on or trying to trick them. It's just they believe what they're saying, and there's a lot of reasons why you might think you're being, really democratic about the change process, but behind the scenes, you've got your processes lined up. You're kind of running on autopilot, and that happens a lot, right? That's normal for us to stick to the thing we know. So if you're introducing new things, really think about whether you're doing what you're saying you're doing, and ask people. If you think you're leading participatory change, but everyone else in your organization does not think that, then you might not be, and it might be time to rethink, how
Mhm.
you're doing it and how you can improve it.
And what are some times when participatory change may not be the best model for enacting change?
Oh gosh, that's a good question because there are times. We talked about the shift to remote work for a lot of organizations in 2020. That is not a good time to say, everyone, let's have a town hall and decide whether or not we should stay home for everyone's safety. Someone just has to make an executive decision and say, this is what's best right now. Time is of the essence. We have to move. And there will always be a need for those types of, top down quick changes. And that's fine. Just we can also make room for some of the other participatory ones too.
So there's a story that I heard. I can't remember if it was someone in my MBA program with me, but right during COVID, when the world fell apart, that they were working at Lazy Boy, and essentially there was a town hall that said, "Hey, sales are slowing down. We need to take a pause. So what should we do? Would you be willing to take, as an organization, a 25% pay cut, or should we lay off 25% of our workforce?" And I'm pretty sure what the executives came up with, and I don't know if it was just executives, higher level leaders, senior level management, or if it was the whole organization as a whole, but if they essentially said, let's take a pay cut. Us executives, we're going to take 50% off our pay, and hopefully we'll be able to keep jobs rather than 10% of the workforce losing their jobs. What if we all take a percentage cut? So that's an example of that kind of a town hall meeting that I think was really effective, because that's something that literally is going to cost hundreds of people their jobs. So, I do think there are times when participatory change would work, but kind of like what you were saying, I also think there are times when participatory change may not be the best model.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great example. I like that story. And yeah, that was probably super meaningful to the people who work there to know, okay, maybe some or all of us are getting pay cuts, but we've got job security now in a really turbulent time. So
Mhm.
I like that story. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Vanessa, as we wind down, there's one question I want to ask you. This is the Psychology of Business podcast. I want to help people be more successful at work. I want to inform people about the cool things people are working on. But you're someone who's been successful in your career. You have your own consulting firm. You work for a larger consulting firm. You just graduated with your doctorate. What do you think is one thing that you've done that has really helped you be successful? And I know a lot of people don't like talking about themselves and bragging about themselves, but if you had to give advice to someone else from someone who is successful, what advice do you have for someone who's trying to succeed in their career?
I think something that is an ongoing battle for me, but something that I'm putting a lot of work into. So I'll say that I think it's been helpful is something we've kind of been touching on, and that's, I guess, a combination of self awareness, emotional intelligence, just prioritizing that because I think so many types of communication, so many relationships don't go successfully because you're not really aware of how you're speaking, how you're communicating, how you're coming across to the other person. And, whether you're leading change or, trying to get someone to hire you for something, I do think that really recognizing how you're coming across and what you're saying can really make a difference. And I'm sure we've all met those people who are not really self-aware, and people notice, right? People talk about it. So doing your best to do whatever it is that you need to kind of look inward and analyze your own behavior, which is really hard and not fun most of the time, but it's so important, I think.
Well, I think a testament to how Vanessa's been working on this. I met Vanessa a week and a half ago. We met at a random conference, and here she is on my podcast. I think you're someone who's, open. You're someone who's been easy to talk to. So it's been great.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that, Brandon. And I enjoyed talking with you.
All right, Vanessa, if people want to check you out, if they want to hire an amazing consultant like Dr. Hills here, where do they go to find you?
I have a website, hillshift.com, but I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you can always find me over there.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, a big thanks for watching this. Vanessa, thank you so much for coming on my channel. But everyone, you have a great day and happy learning.